The Lost Cat of Whispering Woods. ##, a tale of courage, mystery, and friendship. Chapter 1. The disappearance of Pasha. The first thing Zeynep noticed that morning was the silence. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a lazy Saturday, the kind where you could hear birds singing and neighbors mowing their lawns and the distant laughter of kids playing down the street. This was a heavy silence, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up even when you didn't know why. Zeynep was 10 years old, with dark curly hair that refused to be tamed no matter how much her mom tried, and a curiosity that her teachers either loved or found exhausting depending on the day. She lived on Maple Street in the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and nothing exciting ever happened. Until today. She was walking to her best friend Can's house, taking the shortcut through the community garden, when she saw Mrs. Rodriguez. The old woman was standing by the garden gate, and she was crying. Actually crying, tears running down her weathered face as she clutched something orange against her chest. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" Zeynep said, hurrying over. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Rodriguez looked up, and Zeynep was startled by how lost she seemed. Mrs. Rodriguez was the kind of person who always seemed to have everything together. She ran the garden, organized the neighborhood watch, and made cookies for every kid's birthday. Seeing her cry was like seeing a mountain crumble. "It's Pasha," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice breaking. "She's gone. She went into Whispering Woods last night and never came back." Zeynep felt her stomach drop. Pasha was the neighborhood's unofficial mascot, a large orange tabby cat with white paws and the sweetest disposition. She belonged to Mrs. Rodriguez but was everybody's cat really. She'd show up at block parties and park picnics, let little kids pet her, and had this way of knowing when someone needed comfort. Last year, when Zeynep's grandfather had died, Pasha had spent 3 days basically living on their front porch, appearing whenever Zeynep needed to cry into her fur. What was she doing in the woods? Zeynep asked. Whispering Woods was the dense forest that bordered their neighborhood. A tangle of old oak and maple trees, thick underbrush, and winding paths that most parents warned their kids away from. "I don't know," Mrs. Rodriguez said, wiping her eyes. "She's been acting strange for the past few days. Restless, pacing. Yesterday evening she kept going to the back fence and meowing at the woods. Then around sunset, she just slipped through a gap in the fence and ran. I tried to follow her, but I'm too old and slow. I lost sight of her within minutes." She held out what she was clutching. It was Pasha's collar, the red one with the little bell. "I found this just inside the tree line. The clasp is broken. Whatever happened, it happened fast." Zeynep took the collar, turning it over in her hands. The bell jingled softly, a sound that usually meant Pasha was nearby, ready for pets and treats. Now it just sounded lonely. "Did you call the animal shelter?" Zeynep asked. "Or post on those lost pet websites?" "I did all that last night," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "But Zeynep, she's not just lost. There's something else. Pasha is pregnant." "Pregnant?" Zeynep repeated, startled. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded. "I noticed a few weeks ago. She's due soon, any day now," the vet said. I think she went into the woods to find a safe place to have her kittens. Cats do that sometimes, find a quiet, hidden spot. But those woods are dangerous. There are coyotes, raccoons, all sorts of things that could hurt a cat, especially one about to give birth." The worry in Mrs. Rodriguez's voice was palpable. Zeynep made a decision right then, the kind of instant, gut-level decision that would shape everything that came after. "I'll find her," she said. "Zeynep, honey, those woods are big. And your parents. I'll get my friends to help. Can and Mert. We'll be careful and we'll stick together." "But Mrs. Rodriguez, Pasha is our cat too. The neighborhood's cat. We can't just leave her out there." Mrs. Rodriguez looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're a good kid, Zeynep. Always have been. But promise me you'll be safe. Don't go too deep. And if you're not back by dark, I'm calling everyone's parents." "We'll be back," Zeynep promised. With Pasha, she just hoped it was a promise she could keep. 20 minutes later, Zeynep stood in Can's driveway with her 2 best friends, explaining the situation. Ken was her age, tall for 10 with glasses that were always sliding down his nose, and a brain that could solve math problems that made Zeynep's head hurt. Mert was 11, stocky and solid, with a baseball cap that he wore backward and a practical streak that balanced out Zeynep's impulsiveness. "So let me get this straight," Mert said, adjusting his cap. "You want us to go into Whispering Woods, the woods our parents have specifically told us to stay out of, to look for a pregnant cat who might be anywhere in several square miles of forest?" "Yes," Zeynep said simply. "Okay, just checking," Mert said. "I'm in." Ken pushed his glasses up his nose. "Obviously we're helping, but we need a plan. We can't just wander randomly through the woods hoping to stumble across her." This was why Zeynep loved her friends. No hesitation, no second-guessing. Just immediate acceptance and practical planning. "Okay," Zeynep said, pulling out the notebook she always carried. "What do we know about Pasha and her behavior?" "She's pregnant and looking for a safe place to have kittens," Ken said, ticking items off on his fingers. "So she'd want somewhere enclosed, protected from weather and predators. A cave, a hollow log, maybe an old shed or structure if there's anything like that in the woods." "She went in at sunset," Zeynep added, "and Mrs. Rodriguez said she lost sight of her quickly. So Pasha was moving fast, like she knew where she was going. Which means she might have been in those woods before," Mert concluded. "Scouting locations. Cats do that, right? They plan ahead." Ken nodded. "Definitely. So we're not looking for random spots. We're looking for the kind of place a smart cat would choose, sheltered, hidden, accessible but defendable." Zeynep was already sketching a rough map of Whispering Woods based on what she knew. The woods weren't huge, maybe a mile across at the widest point, but they were dense and crossed by a small creek that wound through the center. "If I were a cat looking for shelter," she said slowly, "I'd want to be near water but not too close, high enough that I wouldn't get flooded if it rains. And," she paused, thinking, "and I'd want to be able to see anyone approaching. Somewhere with a good view." "So higher ground near the creek," Ken said, leaning over to look at the map. "That narrows it down. There are those old hills on the eastern side where the creek runs through. And there used to be an old ranger station out there," Mert added. "My dad told me about it once. It's been abandoned for years. If that's still standing, even partially, that's exactly the kind of place a cat would choose." They looked at each other, and Zeynep saw her own determination reflected in their faces. "We'll need supplies," Ken said. "Flashlights, even though it's daytime. Water. Snacks. First aid kit. Maybe some cat treats to lure Pasha if we find her." "And we tell our parents we're going to the park," Mert said. "Not technically a lie, we'll pass through the park to get to the woods. We just won't mention the woods part." "Meeting back here in 15 minutes, Zeynep said. "And guys, thank you. That's what friends are for," Ken said simply. 15 minutes later, they reconvened with backpacks full of supplies. Zeynep had also brought Pasha's favorite toy, a little stuffed mouse that squeaked, thinking the familiar scent might help. The entrance to Whispering Woods was at the far end of Maple Street, where the pavement gave way to a dirt path that quickly disappeared into the trees. There was a faded sign that read, "Private property. No trespassing." But kids had been ignoring it for years. The woods weren't actually dangerous in any official sense. There were no cliffs or toxic plants or anything like that. But they were easy to get lost in, and more than one kid had to be rescued after wandering off the path and panicking. Which was why they were going to be careful. "Okay," Zeynep said, standing at the tree line and feeling her heart beat a little faster. The woods looked different up close, darker and more mysterious than they did from the safety of the street. "We stick together. No one wanders off alone. We mark our trail so we can find our way back. And if we're not making progress by 3 o'clock, we head home and try again tomorrow with better information." "Agreed," Ken and Mert said together. They stepped into the woods. The temperature dropped immediately, the canopy of leaves blocking out the warm summer sun. The path was clear at first, wide enough for them to walk two abreast, covered in last fall's leaves that crunched under their feet. Birds sang overhead, and something small rustled in the underbrush nearby. "Kind of pretty," Mert observed. I can see why Pasha would like it here. They walked for maybe 10 minutes before the path started to split and branch. Zeynep pulled out a roll of bright orange surveyor's tape she'd borrowed from her dad's garage and tied a strip to a tree branch. Breadcrumbs, she said, so we can find our way home. They chose the path that seemed to lead east, toward where Ken thought the old hills and the ranger station might be. The going was slower now, the path was narrower, more overgrown. Branches grabbed at their clothes and hair. The birdsong seemed farther away. Pasha, Zeynep called out. Here, kitty. Pasha. Her voice seemed to get swallowed by the trees, not echoing like it would in an open space. Beside her, Ken was pulling out his phone. No signal, he reported. We're on our own out here. They continued deeper into the woods, calling Pasha's name, stopping occasionally to listen for any response. Zeynep kept the orange tape marking their route, and Ken was keeping track of their progress with a compass app he'd downloaded before they lost signal. After about 30 minutes of walking, they heard it, water running over rocks. The creek. We're getting close, Mert said, his voice hushed. The woods had that effect, making you want to speak quietly, like you were in a library or a church. They followed the sound of water until they found the creek. It was prettier than Zeynep had expected, maybe 15 feet across, shallow enough to see the rocky bottom, running clear and cold over smooth stones. Trees leaned over it from both sides, creating a tunnel of green. Okay, Ken said, consulting his compass. If we follow the creek east, we should hit higher ground within half a mile. That's where we should focus our search. They walked along the creek bank, sometimes having to scramble over fallen logs or navigate around particularly thick patches of thorny bushes. Zeynep kept calling for Pasha, kept listening for the sound of a meow or the jingle of a collar bell, even though she knew the collar was broken. They were maybe 40 minutes into the woods when Mert stopped suddenly, holding up his hand for silence. What? Zeynep whispered. Look, Mert said, pointing. At first, Zeynep didn't see what he was pointing at. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw it, orange fur, just a tuft of it, caught on a thorny branch beside the creek. Pasha was here, Ken breathed. Zeynep carefully extracted the fur from the thorns. It was definitely Pasha's color, and it was fresh, not faded or weathered like it would be if it had been here for days. She came this way, Zeynep said, feeling hope surge in her chest. Recently, we're on the right track. They moved faster now, energized by this evidence that they were heading in the right direction. The ground was starting to slope upward, getting rockier. The creek was narrower here, rushing faster over a steeper gradient. And then Ken spotted it, a structure barely visible through the trees. There, he said, pointing. Is that the ranger station? They scrambled up the slope toward it. The building, if you could still call it that, was in rough shape. It had been a small cabin once, maybe 2 rooms, but the roof had partially collapsed and the walls were weathered and covered in vines. The windows were broken. The door hung crooked on its hinges. But it was shelter, enclosed, protected, exactly the kind of place a pregnant cat might choose. Pasha? Zeynep called softly, approaching the sagging door. Pasha, are you in there? For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from inside the dark interior of the cabin, came a sound that made Zeynep's heart leap. A soft, tired meow. ## Chapter 2. The Rescue. Zeynep's hands were shaking as she pushed the creaking door open wider, letting more light into the cabin's interior. The smell hit her first. Musty wood, old leaves, and something else, something warm and alive. Pasha? She called again, softer this time. Another meow, stronger now, and definitely Pasha's voice. Zeynep would know that sound anywhere. She stepped carefully into the cabin, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the dimness. Ken and Mert crowded in behind her, Ken clicking on his flashlight to help them see. The interior was worse than the exterior. The floor was rotted through in places, exposing the dirt beneath. The collapsed section of roof had let in rain and weather, creating piles of soggy debris in one corner. But the other corner, the one farthest from the door and most protected by what remained of the roof, was different. Someone, or rather some cat, had made a nest there. It was actually quite elaborate. Old leaves and dried grass had been arranged into a surprisingly cozy-looking pile, tucked between what looked like an old storage chest and the wall. And curled in the center of that nest, looking exhausted but alert, was Pasha. "Oh, Pasha," Zeynep breathed, moving closer but carefully, not wanting to startle her. The orange tabby's eyes tracked Zeynep's movement, and she meowed again, this time with what sounded like relief. But she didn't get up. She couldn't get up, Zeynep realized, because tucked against her belly, tiny and squirming, were 4 tiny bundles of fur. She had her babies. Ken whispered from behind Zeynep, his voice full of awe. The kittens were so new they could barely be hours old. Their eyes were closed, their ears flat against their heads, and they were making tiny mewing sounds as they nursed. 3 of them were orange like Pasha, 1 was striped gray, and all of them were smaller than Zeynep's fist. "Hi, Pasha," Zeynep said softly, kneeling down a safe distance away. "You're a mama now. They're beautiful." Pasha meowed again, this time with a note of distress. Through her actions, the way she kept looking toward the broken window, the way her ears swiveled at every sound, Zeynep understood. Pasha was scared. She'd found a place to have her babies, but now she was stuck here, exhausted and unable to protect them if something dangerous came along. "We're going to help you," Zeynep promised. "We'll get you and your babies home safely." "Question," Mert said from near the door where he was keeping watch. "How exactly are we going to do that? We can't exactly carry a cat and 4 newborn kittens through the woods. And Pasha might not let us handle the babies." It was a good point. Zeynep thought hard, looking around the cabin for inspiration. Her eyes landed on the old storage chest that partially sheltered Pasha's nest. "Can help me with this?" she said, moving toward the chest. Together, they carefully opened it, half expecting it to fall apart. The interior was surprisingly dry and empty except for some old papers and what looked like a moth-eaten blanket. "Perfect," Zeynep said, pulling out the blanket and shaking it carefully to dislodge any bugs or debris. "Ken, you're the lightest and have the steadiest hands. I need you to very, very carefully transfer the kittens into this chest. Make sure the blanket is settled in first as padding." "Me?" Ken looked terrified. "What if I hurt them?" "You won't," Zeynep said with more confidence than she felt. "You're careful. You've got this." While Ken prepared the chest with the blanket, creating a cozy nest similar to what Pasha had built, Zeynep slowly extended her hand toward Pasha, letting the cat sniff her fingers. Pasha sniffed, then butted her head against Zeynep's hand. Permission granted. "Good girl," Zeynep murmured, gently stroking Pasha's head. "We're friends, remember? We're going to take care of your babies." Ken knelt beside the nest, his face scrunched up in concentration. With movements so gentle Zeynep barely breathed, he scooped up the first kitten, one of the orange ones, and transferred it to the chest. The kitten mewed in protest but settled quickly into the warm blanket. Pasha watched but didn't interfere. She seemed to understand that they were helping. One by one, Ken moved the kittens, the second orange one, the gray-striped one, and finally the smallest orange kitten, the runt of the litter. Each time he was extraordinarily careful, and each time, the kitten settled into the makeshift nest in the chest. "Okay," Ken said, sitting back and wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool temperature. "They're all in." Now came the tricky part. "Pasha," Zeynep said gently, "your babies are safe, but we need to move them home. Okay? Can you walk?" She didn't really expect Pasha to understand the words, but cats were smart. And sure enough, when Zeynep carefully lifted the chest, which thankfully was small and light, Pasha struggled to her feet. The cat was exhausted, that much was obvious. Her movements were slow and careful, and she swayed slightly. But she followed as Zeynep carried the chest toward the door, meowing softly to her kittens. "This might actually work," Mert said, sounding surprised. They made their way out of the cabin and back toward the creek. The journey was much slower now. Zeynep had to carry the chest carefully, making sure not to jostle the kittens too much. Ken walked beside her, ready to help if she needed it. and Mert led the way, following the orange tape markers they'd left. Pasha walked behind them, stopping frequently to rest, but always following the chest that carried her babies. They were about halfway back when they heard it, a sound that made all three kids freeze. Howling, not far away. "Coyotes," Mert said, his voice tight. "We need to move. Now." But they couldn't move fast, not with the kittens. And Pasha was already exhausted. The howl came again, closer this time. Through the trees, Zeynep caught a glimpse of something moving. Low to the ground, gray-brown, canine. "Ideas would be great right about now," Ken said, his voice higher than usual. Zeynep's mind raced. They couldn't outrun coyotes. They couldn't climb trees with the kittens. They needed the creek, she said suddenly. "Coyotes don't like water. If we can get to the creek and cross it, they might not follow." It was their best shot. They hurried toward the sound of running water, Mert pushing branches out of the way, Ken helping Zeynep with the chest, Pasha limping along behind them. The coyote appeared from the underbrush, a rangy male with sharp eyes and hungry expression. It saw them and froze for a moment, assessing. Then it started moving toward them, not running but definitely approaching. "Keep going," Mert shouted. I'll think of something." They burst through the last line of trees and reached the creek bank. The water looked colder and faster than Zeynep remembered, the rocks slippery with algae. The coyote was maybe 30 feet behind them now. "Can take the chest," Zeynep said, passing it to him. "Get across with the kittens. Mert, help him. I'll get Pasha." But Ken started to protest. "Go!" Ken and Mert scrambled across the creek, Ken holding the chest high to keep it dry, Mert steadying him when he slipped on the rocks. They made it to the other side, the kittens crying but safe. Zeynep scooped up Pasha. Not easy with an adult cat, especially one who wasn't thrilled about being picked up, and turned to face the creek. The coyote was at the tree line now, watching them with intelligent, hungry eyes. Zeynep stepped into the water. It was shockingly cold, immediately soaking through her sneakers. The current was stronger than it looked, pulling at her ankles. Pasha yowled and dug her claws into Zeynep's arms, but Zeynep held on tight. Step by careful step, she made her way across. The rocks were slippery, and more than once she nearly lost her balance. Behind her, she heard the coyote whining, pacing at the water's edge. Ken was reaching out from the far bank. "Almost there. You've got this." One more step. Another. And then Ken was grabbing her arm, helping her onto the bank, and they were all across, all safe. The coyote watched them from the other side of the creek. Then, as if deciding they weren't worth the effort, turned and trotted back into the woods. Zeynep set Pasha down gently, and the cat immediately went to the chest, sniffing and meowing at her babies. All 4 kittens mewed back, safe and sound. "That," Mert said, breathing hard, "was way too close." "But we did it," Ken said, grinning despite everything. "We actually did it." Zeynep looked at her friends, at the exhausted cat, at the chest full of tiny, precious lives, and felt something swell in her chest. Pride, maybe, or joy, or just pure relief. "Come on," she said. "Let's get them home." ## Chapter 3. Homecoming. The walk back through the woods felt longer than the walk in, probably because Zeynep's arms were getting tired from carrying the chest and her wet sneakers were starting to give her blisters. But none of that mattered because they'd done it. They'd found Pasha and her kittens, and they were bringing them home safe. Pasha walked slowly behind them, still exhausted but determined to stay close to her babies. Every time they stopped to rest, which was frequently, she would immediately go to the chest, sniffing and touching noses with each kitten through the gaps in the old wood. "She's such a good mom," Ken observed during one of their rest stops. "Look how she keeps checking on them." It was true. Despite being exhausted, despite having just given birth hours ago, despite having been scared and alone in the woods, Pasha's primary concern was her kittens. She barely even groomed herself, too focused on making sure her babies were okay. When they finally emerged from Whispering Woods back onto Maple Street, the sun was lower in the sky than Zeynep had expected. It had to be around 4 o'clock, They'd been gone for hours. "Oh man," Mert said, checking his watch. "We're so grounded." "Worth it," Zeynep said simply. Mrs. Rodriguez's house was 2 blocks away. They walked there together, drawing curious looks from neighbors working in their yards. 3 dirty, wet kids carrying an old chest with a bedraggled orange cat following along wasn't exactly a common sight on Maple Street. Mrs. Rodriguez was in her front yard, and the moment she saw Pasha. She burst into tears all over again, but this time they were happy tears. "You found her!" she cried, hurrying over as fast as her elderly legs could carry her. "Oh, my sweet girl, you're okay. And you?" She stopped when she got close enough to see into the chest, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my goodness! Babies!" She had babies. 4 of them, Zeynep said proudly. "All healthy. We found them in an old cabin in the woods. Pasha picked a safe place to give birth, but I think she was stuck there. She couldn't leave the kittens, but she was too tired to move them herself." Mrs. Rodriguez knelt down carefully, reaching out to let Pasha sniff her hand. Pasha meowed, a sound that managed to convey both complaint, "Where were you?" and relief, "Thank you for finding me." "Let's get them inside," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've got a room ready. I've been hoping so hard that you'd find her." They brought the chest inside, to a small room off the kitchen that Mrs. Rodriguez had prepared. There was a large cardboard box lined with soft blankets, food and water dishes, and a small space heater to keep everything warm. So carefully, they transferred the kittens from the chest to the box. Pasha supervised, meowing instructions that only she understood. Once all the babies were settled, Pasha climbed into the box herself, circling twice before lying down and letting the kittens nurse. "Perfect," Mrs. Rodriguez breathed. "Just perfect. Thank you, all of you. You saved Pasha and her babies. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to repay us," Zeynep said. "Pasha's everybody's cat. We take care of each other in this neighborhood, right?" Mrs. Rodriguez smiled through her tears. "Right. But I'm still calling your parents to tell them what heroes you are. Though I might leave out the part about the coyote, no need to give them heart attacks." As it turned out, they all got varying degrees of trouble for going into the woods without permission. Zeynep was grounded for a week, though her parents admitted they were proud of her bravery. Ken lost his video game privileges for 3 days. Mert had to do extra chores for a week. But as punishments went, they were pretty light. And they were definitely worth it. The neighborhood rallied around Pasha and her kittens. Someone started a group chat to coordinate help. Volunteers to check on them, to bring supplies, to make sure Mrs. Rodriguez didn't have to do everything herself. Kids came by to see the kittens through the doorway. Mrs. Rodriguez was strict about not disturbing them too much. Adults brought food and offers of help. It turned out that saving the neighborhood cat had brought the neighborhood closer together. Zeynep visited every day, sitting quietly in the room with Pasha and the kittens. The babies grew fast. Within days, their eyes were starting to open, showing blue kitten eyes that would eventually change color. Within a week, they were starting to wobble around the box on unsteady legs. Pasha seemed to remember that Zeynep had rescued her. Whenever Zeynep visited, Pasha would purr and rub against her, then carefully pick up one of the kittens by the scruff and place it in Zeynep's lap, the ultimate sign of trust from a mother cat. "She's telling you that you're family," Mrs. Rodriguez said, watching this interaction with a soft smile. "That's what mother cats do. They introduce their babies to the people they trust." 3 weeks after the rescue, Mrs. Rodriguez called a neighborhood meeting in her backyard. By then, the kittens were little bundles of chaos, tumbling over each other, pouncing on anything that moved, and generally being adorable menaces. "I wanted to thank everyone for their help these past weeks," Mrs. Rodriguez said, standing in front of the gathered crowd. Probably 50 people from the neighborhood, from little kids to elderly retirees. "Pasha and her babies are doing wonderfully, and that's thanks to all of you, especially Zeynep, Can, and Mert, who risked themselves to bring her home." Everyone clapped, and Zeynep felt her face turn red. "Now," Mrs. Rodriguez continued, "the kittens are old enough to start looking for homes. I can keep Pasha and 1 kitten, but 3 need good families. If you're interested in adopting one, please talk to me after the meeting. By the end of the evening, all 3 kittens had been promised homes, all on Maple Street, so they'd grow up near their mother and siblings. The little gray-striped one was going to the Johnsons. The smallest orange one was going to a family with 3 kids who promised they'd be gentle. And the biggest orange kitten, the one who'd been brave and calm through the whole chest transport adventure, was going to Zeynep's family. Really? Zeynep said, looking at her parents with wide eyes. We can keep her? We talked about it, her mom said. You showed a lot of responsibility and courage during the rescue. We think you're ready for the responsibility of a pet. Zeynep named her kitten Scout because she'd been brave and adventurous from the start. And Scout turned out to be the perfect cat. Curious, fearless, and always ready for an adventure, just like Zeynep. On summer evenings, when the neighborhood gathered in the park for picnics, you could see Pasha and her grown kittens wandering from family to family, accepting pets and treats, watched over by the community that had saved them. And sometimes, when Zeynep sat on her front porch with Scout curled in her lap, she'd look toward Whispering Woods and remember that day. The fear and the courage, the danger and the triumph. The moment when 3 kids decided to be brave for a friend who couldn't ask for help. It had been the best adventure of her life. And knowing Scout, who was already trying to climb the curtains and investigate the ceiling fan, it wouldn't be the last. Ken came over one afternoon a few months after the rescue, with Mert right behind him, and they sat on the porch while Scout attacked their shoelaces. Remember when we thought nothing exciting ever happened in this neighborhood? Ken said, laughing. And then we rescued a cat from the woods and had to escape from coyotes? Mert added. And became heroes? Zeynep finished. They looked at each other and grinned. Best summer ever, they said together. Scout meowed in agreement and pounced on a fallen leaf, because to a kitten, every day was an adventure. And really, Zeynep thought, wasn't that the best way to live? The end.